truly entered historic territory. But most of us don't even realize it. The inflation crisis of 2022 has escalated to a level that's beyond anything we've ever witnessed, even surpassing the horrible cost of living crisis experienced during the Jimmy Carter era of the 1970s. However, many of us weren't alive during those times to remember how terrible it was back then. And it is safe to say that inflation is not a hot topic amongst the young. That's why most Americans don't really care about inflation. But that's mainly because they don't fully understand how it affects the value of their money, and consequently, their buying power. You can find numerous definitions and explanations out there, but the thing you really should keep in mind is that inflation is an invisible tax that makes you spend more and more to get less and less. And when people start waking up to the fact that we're in the middle of a new economic crisis that will bring about lots of financial stress for everyone, they'll start fuming with rage. Inflation levels are still spinning out of control, and what we've seen so far are just the very early chapters of a long downturn that'll make our money virtually worthless. But before exposing some very alarming facts and forecasts, please don't forget to leave a thumbs up on this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our future videos. For most of the past 2 years, government authorities and the corporate media tried to make us believe that we were exiting an economic recession to enter an era of prosperity. They've been insisting that inflation would be proven temporary and that everything would eventually fall into place. They've been denying at all costs that we would end up falling into an inflation spiral that would lead us to an economic meltdown, just as it happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And yet, this is just where we are right now. Official numbers tell us that what we are experiencing today is not even close to what Americans went through during those times, but they actually conceal the fact that the way inflation was calculated back then was different. And in order to make a straight comparison, we have to readjust that equation and include some economic fundamentals that have been left behind. Thankfully, economist and founder of GovernmentShadowStats.com, John Williams, has done the math for us. In the early 1980s, the inflation rate hit a record high of 14.6%. Compared to that, the numbers we have been given in early 2022 seem rather tame. A couple of weeks ago, we learned that the official rate of inflation in the U.S. hit 8.5% in March, the highest level since the early days of the Reagan administration, according to Labor Department data. In the face of these numbers, most people would logically conclude that we're still a long way from the kind of nightmarish crisis that our nation endured during the waning days of the Carter administration. But when we make a apples-to-apples comparison, calculating the rate of inflation the way it was originally calculated, the official rate of inflation would be somewhere around 17% right now, as Williams reported. This means that the cost of living in this country has risen 17% in less than 2 years. By comparison, in normal times, a healthy inflation rate would be somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5%. This leaves us with the highest living expenses and consumer prices ever recorded in the entire history of America. The official numbers are so deceitful that when we analyze individual categories, it becomes clear that inflation levels are not only at 8.5%. For example, the price of gasoline has risen by 48% from March 2021 to March 2022, according to numbers released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In just 1 month, from February to March, the seasonally adjusted price of gasoline jumped by 18.3%, just 1 month. To make things worse, right as the world starts facing a new oil crisis, the U.S. government decides to export our fuel reserves to other countries. But instead of helping Ukrainians or European countries that are experiencing a devastating energy crisis, we're exporting fuel to fuel-producing countries in Latin America as winter starts in the southern hemisphere. As a result, domestic supplies of gasoline and diesel are rapidly dwindling, and fuel prices are soaring even higher. Diesel prices, which hit a record $5.16 per gallon last week and have remained on average $1 per gallon higher than gasoline prices, are largely being blamed for the higher prices Americans are paying for consumer goods, which are transported by trucks that are fueled by diesel. According to AAA on Monday, diesel prices rose further to $5.321 per gallon, and gasoline prices are nearing a record high. At the same time, we're seeing vehicle prices climb to absurd levels as the auto industry scrambles to fight against factory shutdowns, against shortages, and against shipping disruptions. Over the past 12 months, the average retail selling price of a used vehicle at CarMax increased by 39.7% to $29,312. That's up approximately $8,300 from a year ago. According to the S&P Global U.S. Manufacturing PMI, the auto industry isn't the only one struggling with rising production costs and disrupted supply chains all across the board. U.S. manufacturers are reporting that inflation is out of control, and it hasn't peaked but intensified in the past quarter. The report reveals that U.S. manufacturers reported that inflation in April accelerated and inflationary pressures showed no signs of relenting amid sharp increases in cost burdens and selling prices and continued shortages from suppliers, with lead times from suppliers lengthening further as suppliers struggle with severe material and capacity shortages. Both input costs and selling price inflation surged higher, the latter accelerating to a near-record rate as firms faced rising energy prices, ongoing supplier-driven price hikes amid strained supply chains, and rising wage costs, the PMI report highlighted. Higher cost burdens were attributed to greater material and supplier prices, notably increased transportation, increased fuel, and increased metals expenses, it added. Firms continued to pass higher material and staff costs onto clients in April as the rate of charge inflation accelerated. The increase in selling prices was the fastest since last October. On top of that, many companies are rushing to stockpile input materials to counteract price increases and shortages. In line with a further upturn in new orders, firms raised their input buying at a sharp pace. Many companies stated that higher purchasing activity was linked to efforts to stockpile inputs amid price increases and material shortages, the report said. So, when we think we've already seen the worst of inflation, we're told that more price hikes happened all across the industry last month, and soon they will hit the stores. As the cost of living crisis bites, consumer prices have already been causing a lot of pain. The latest data shows that home prices in the United States have risen a shocking 32.6% over the past 2 years. Meanwhile, as food supplies get tighter and tighter all across the nation, consumers are getting increasingly frustrated when they go grocery shopping. If you think paying $10 for a pound of bacon or $6 for a pound of butter is way too much, hey, we're sorry to say, but it's about to get even more expensive. In a few weeks, you'll be paying a lot more for just about everything when it comes to eating in or dining out, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. All food prices are now predicted to increase. The USDA's food prices outlook for 2022 March report said, and the coming increases are the highest in decades. So far this year, grocery prices have already risen 9%, and the USDA predicts an additional 4.5 to 5% rise in food prices to happen this year, totaling a 14% increase from 2021 levels, and that's on top of all the other increases consumers faced over the past several months. The report also highlighted that no food category decreased in price over the past year, and now the USDA has revised its forecast upward for all food categories, including meats, poultry, eggs, dairy products, fats and oils, and more. The swift rise in food prices is already squeezing the budgets of low-income families. Food banks all around the country are reporting significant growth in demand. In a recent interview, Kay O'Reilly, the director of the Chapel Pantry at Eastern Shore Chapel Episcopal Church, said that the facility is seeing more folks in need of assistance, including many first-timers, as rampant inflation eats away at what they can afford at the supermarket. Unfortunately, the pantry is contending with higher costs and supply chain problems, which have made it much harder to fill the shelves. The same is happening at many food banks and pantries around the U.S. According to Feeding America, roughly 65% of the 200 food banks in the organization's network reported seeing a greater demand for food assistance. Even though food banks are buying nearly as much food as they did in 2021, they're paying about 40% more for the purchases. However, the organization is projecting it will suffer a 20% decrease in donations from food manufacturers and a 45% drop in food provided by the federal government in the fiscal year 2022, which runs through June. "We are in danger of running out of food," said Vince Hall, Feeding America's Chief Government Relations Officer. "We're doing everything we can to avert a major hunger crisis." Before the health crisis, it would be inconceivable that so many Americans would be experiencing food insecurity all of a sudden, but this tragic situation illustrates the kind of nightmare scenario that is now upon us. Sadly, economic conditions will continue to rapidly deteriorate, and if another black swan event hits us later this year, it wouldn't take much at all to push our nation over the edge and into an unprecedented economic crisis of catastrophic proportions. We are rapidly transitioning from stagflation to a full-blown economic recession, and the consequences of it are going to be devastating. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, we strongly recommend you buy 7-Year Apocalypse, the latest book by the economist and financial expert Mr. Michael Snyder. In the meantime, feel free to share this message with friends and family. Turn on the notification bell to always keep updated with our latest notification. We look forward to seeing your comments below this video, and thank you for watching.